and training of professionals in Asia and Middle East. Crano.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. I don't know how many of you saw the dance program just before me, but I'm going to complain to Paulo for putting me behind that. It's too hard an act to follow, but I'll do my best. I want to talk about what we've done wrong and what we could have done right if we had known something more. The National Youth Anti-Drug Media Campaign was a 4-year-long campaign that was run in the United States, and it cost $1.4 billion. That's billion with a B. It was a national campaign, and the audience, primary audience, was 12 to 18 years old. They covered every conceivable medium that you can imagine. Even television, radio, signs on buses, billboards, everything, magazines. It was a colossal failure. At the end of the campaign, the evaluation, which itself cost $56 million, showed that not only did the campaign fail, but in fact it helped establish a norm that more people were using marijuana than in fact was true, and also that the more of the advertisements that kids watched, the more marijuana they smoked. The reason for this, they blamed, well, the media doesn't work. We can't use mass media to promulgate, to put out messages. That's nonsense. I told them at the time, and I'll tell you now, if you have a lunch that you don't like, you throw the lunch away, you don't throw the plate away. Okay? It's not the medium that is at fault, it's the messages that we were delivering. So I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the messages. And ultimately, I want to progress to ideas about the importance of parents in prevention. They're our best ally. They may be our only ally that work well. This is a national data from the United States looking at our progress in prevention over the past 10 years. If you draw a line through each of these lines, the best line you can draw is a straight line, the straight line that is flat. We've spent probably $1 million every year during those 10 years on prevention, and this is what we've received. This is the output. Nothing. It's a colossal failure. And the question is why? And the second question is, why should we care? Should we care that we have kids, many of them, using marijuana? Well, marijuana, if you smoke enough and you're a kid, it will retard your learning and achievement. It will cause higher levels of delinquency. It will do all of these things that I've listed, but I want to especially call your attention to these two notes in yellow. If you smoke a lot of marijuana as a kid, you are much more open to multi-drug use, polydrug use, many drugs being used as you get older. So it's not a kid drug. And also what our National Academy found was that if you smoke continuously for a couple of years, the development of your brain has stopped. So if you start smoking heavily marijuana, and the marijuana today is quite strong, if you smoke strong marijuana for 2 years, at 16, by the time you're 18, your brain development has stopped. Your brain develops from the back to the front. This is where you have reason and logic. How would you like to be a 40-year-old man or woman with the judgment of a 16-year-old? Does that appeal to you? Because that's what we're doing. We knew about this in research that we did in my lab 8 years ago, 9 years, 10 years ago, 10 years ago. How time flies. I want to show you this because I think it's interesting, especially for parents who think it's not so bad if their kids use drugs. We're looking at, it doesn't show up. We're looking at cigarette use of kids. If a kid smokes cigarettes for 2 years, he is 2.49 times more likely to use opioids than if he didn't do that. These are odds ratios. And this is in a sample, a national sample of US adolescents, 12 to 17. Let's go to a different one, marijuana. If the kid uses marijuana for 2 years, he's almost 4 times more likely to use opioids later in his life. If your kid uses inhalant substances, solvents, sniffing things, this is the worst. He is almost 10 times more likely to use opioids and almost 13 times more likely to misuse stimulants in the coming years. These are bad numbers. And these are what we consider in my country kid drugs. Cigarettes, alcohol, marijuana. Kids do that. Yeah, kids do that, and that's the outcome. That's what you get. I don't think it's worth it. Well, let me get to my notes. I can't read my own slides. What's the reason for this? There are 3 reasons that we've been able to show. One of them is a failure to understand how the media works. We don't understand how to do it because most of the people in charge of campaigns are not media people. And those are the media people who are in charge of campaigns are not drug people, not prevention people. So you have a very bad combination of ignorance on both sides. They don't know what the media are designed to do, and they don't know what the media does not do very well. And I'll tell you one of the things that is. The media is is almost useless in trying to get a substance use dependent person to quit. They don't work. Don't do it. It's a waste of money. I'm not saying it isn't a proper goal, but it just doesn't work. Another problem is we don't understand the rules of persuasion. When I try to get you to stop doing or not to start something, I want you not to start using marijuana. What I have to do is to persuade you not to do so. I can't just give you information. I can't say, well, if you use marijuana, you're going to have these kinds of problems. That's not enough. I have to put that together with persuasion. Okay? If you don't persuade, media is useless as a prevention device. Except in very rare cases, which I might be able to talk about. And the third reason is the failure to understand how these 2 facts interact with each other, how they fit together. And that's what I want to try to do, and that's what we try to do in my lab, is to teach media, teach prevention, and marry them. So the first thing I teach is, what is the function of media? What are media meant to do? They're meant to engage you or entertain you. They're meant to inform, or they're meant to persuade, to influence. Some media want to influence you. Buy Chevrolets. You see ads like that almost every day on the media. And Chevrolet is paying millions of dollars every year to sell their cars through the media. Don't tell me that media don't work. If they don't work, they should be firing all of those top-level executives who are making $1 million a year. But they do work. A prevention message has to put all 3 of these together. If they don't do that, they won't succeed. And I want to tell you today about our plan, our scheme for doing this. We've been working on it for 20 years and reading about it for the previous 20 years before that. Luckily, I'm old, so I know both the literature and what to be doing about it, maybe, I think. I'm stuck. Or am I? Okay. Okay. What are the critical features of our persuasive communications? One of the things we assume whenever we enter the field is we assume that our audience is not going to like us. That is, they're going to resist. The ones that we want to persuade are going to resist, because persuasion, by definition, involves resistance. If they don't resist, then I'm just reinforcing their behavior. If they say, oh yeah, I agree with that, I've agreed with that all along, then my telling you don't use this stuff is just going to be persuasive. It's just going to be reinforcing. But if you say, well, you don't know what you're talking about, then I'm in a persuasive contest. And I have to win the contest if I'm going to persuade you to do something or not to do something, which is what I want to do. Many times we fail. And what we've learned through those failures over the years is that we have to do certain things. The first thing we have to do is just raise a question in the minds of the audience. Are you sure this drug is not harmful? A simple question. Why do we do that? Because many of young people's beliefs are at least in part bolstered, strengthened by their idea that everyone else believes as I do. All of my friends, everybody who makes a difference believes as I do. And what we want to do is inject at least a shadow of a doubt that that is not true. That's all we want to do. What do we do next? We raise that question, and then we answer it. Because remember, we're in a debate now. We're in a contest that's going on inside the head of each of my audience members. I raise the question, and I give the answer. Actually, this drug can cause a lot of harm. Maybe not immediately, but if you do it enough, you'll have a lot of problems. And then I have to inform. Here's some research that I just read about online. And it says this and this and this. And the research is impeccable. You can't argue against it because it's too strong. It's from the best research shop in the country, written by the best preventionist in the country. And you're going to tell me that your friend knows better than this? Your friend who's saying this won't hurt you? How smart are you? And then we have to reinforce why you should adopt my ideas. I got bad direction from my director back there. Why you should accept my ideas instead of staying with your own. And that reinforcement can entail a lot of things, like being in agreement with my favorite football star, or being in agreement with a priest I dearly love, or being in agreement with my father, who I respect enormously, or my teacher. Okay, that's reinforcing. It's nice to be on the side of people like that. And so we say that that has to be. Now, we add to that, we're trying to target our message to the specific sensibilities of the audience. We want to talk about things that the audience cares about. So if I try to convince a group like you not to use drugs, it would be different from the message that I would use with a group of children in high school or in elementary school. You need to know the language of the people you're dealing with, of course. But you also have to understand even the words that are used. We have found a lot of problems in some of the research that some of the federal government has used because they were talking about e-cigarettes. Kids today don't talk about at least in Los Angeles, they don't talk about e-cigarettes, they talk about vapes. When I talk about e-cigarettes, they don't know what the hell I'm talking about. Okay, so the message is wasted. It's like a foreign language. It's like speaking Portuguese to them, or to me. Now, yesterday in my course, my colleague, Eusebio Alvaro, talked about how the media are supposed to work. And this is how I think we used to think about it, which is you take a substance prevention communications called the hypodermic model, and we shoot it into the heads of our audience. Okay? Every message goes directly to each person in the audience. And we knew since the 1940s that this isn't the way that it actually operates. Mass media don't work this way. The most powerful way of communicating persuasion is face-to-face. Mass media are not face-to-face. So how do we build that in? We use a different model. We think about what we're doing in a different way. And a brilliant man named Herb Laswell thought about this in the 1946, I think. Basically, he said, no, there's a two-phase process that goes on here. The communication Okay, can't see it on this screen. The communication really should be designed to affect the opinion leader. Who is an opinion leader? An opinion leader is a person who has other people who find him or her very credible, who will listen to what that person says. Opinion leader can have 1,000 people in their audience, or maybe 2, or maybe 1. But the opinion leader absorbs the message and translates it to their followers. Okay? I've made a strong claim to our federal government that in a lot of cases the best opinion leader we can find is the parents. Because believe it or not, even up to the age of 30 or more, children listen to what their parents say. They may not admit it. They may not ever want to show you that, but in fact it has an impact. So don't stop talking to your children if you have some. I'm not saying that you should, of course. In general, I want to try and show you how we can put all of this stuff together. I already said this. Okay. We've dedicated so much money to persuading a very, very resistant audience, which is adolescents. We've dedicated almost no money to persuading parents to talk to their kids. Very little. And the parents are open to communication. They want to know, what do I do with my kids? My kid's going out every night. I don't know, he's coming home funny, he's walking funny. I don't know if he's drinking or what. We have left the parents alone and tried to persuade a group of unpersuadables. That's stupid. Okay? Why would you do that? So what I'm aiming to do, or what I'm pushing our government to do, is put money into communications with parents. And the nice thing is that when children listen to what is being said to their parents about drugs, they aren't being defensive about it. They don't defend themselves against the communication. Why should they? You're talking to my mother. What do I care? And they then get the message too, with much less defense, with much less resistance. So, what do? We start out with the idea that what we ought to start thinking about is a relatively simple question that was, again, developed in the 40s. I don't have a particular fondness for the 1940s, but during the war and after the war, there was a group of, at least in America, a group of propagandists who were quite effective. They learned a lot by doing things, testing them out and seeing what happened. And what they came away from that war with was a book full of things that worked, of persuasive techniques that worked, and at that point they needed to build a theory around it. Here's one of the theories that came out. You need to know, says every journalism school in America, the first class, your first sentence out of your professor's mouth is, who says what to whom, through what media, how, and with what effect. You better learn that on your first class, because when you write something, when you try to get a message across to people in the newspaper, you read the newspaper here, your newsmen do the same thing. Who says it? What are they saying? Who's the audience? And the final thing, with what effect, they don't worry about that. That's not their problem. That's our problem. We need to know if our work is worked, makes a difference. We try to develop our persuasive communications with this question in mind. Who says it? Who are you saying it to? What are you saying? How are you saying it? What medium are you using? And then finally, let's evaluate, see if we were right, see if we succeeded. Sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. I already told you this. Who? What is which is the source of the message? Says what, the content. How's it delivered? The way of delivering is different, of course. If it's TV or radio or a magazine or a blog or a social media or a Palestra, it's different procedures. But mostly the techniques are the same. Who's the receptors? And what's the effect? A communication that's going to persuade you has to have all of these things. The last one, maybe not. But the people who are giving you money to do the research want to know that last thing, that it worked. Because if they don't, they'll quit. They'll quit giving you money to do your research. So in putting all of this together, my lab and I have been working for a number of years, and we've come up with what we think is a model of how you build communications. My students study the literature on persuasion and communication for 4 or 5 years before we get to here. So I'm pushing it along with you guys. You're smarter than, well, you may be smarter than most of my students. Okay, so we developed a model called the Equip to tell you what you need to do if you're going to create a message that is going to be persuasive. My class learned this yesterday, or at least were exposed to it. I hope they absorbed it. The Equip is just an acronym. Each letter stands for something. Okay? It's simple. Why do we care? The Equip does all of the things that we want a persuasive message to do. And it does it in a very formulaic, very simple form. It says you have to have this, you have to have this, you have to have this. And what are those things? Those things are, now Equip doesn't work in Portuguese. You got to make up your own algorithm. But at least in English, the first one, the E, stands for engage. Get people to watch you. If you have to stand on your head, get your audience engaged with you. And keep their engagement for the entire presentation. It may be a minute. It may be as long as 30 seconds. It may be 5 minutes if you have a lot of money to go on TV for that long. Most of the time you don't. You have to do this all at once. The Q, the pregunta, is question. I told you this before. This comes out of the 1950s research. Raise a question. You sure that's not bad for you? And then you destabilize the attitude. You destabilize it by putting in an answer to the question yourself. You answer the question. You say, no, you think it sounds helpful? Actually, there's quite a bit that says it is. A lot of people say, well, I never heard of anybody objecting to this stuff other than old people. And no, there's something wrong with this, and here's the research that does it. The third part, the EQ, the fourth part of the equip is the I, the inform. You back up the destabilization with information. Attitudes are very weak unless they have an underlying floor of information underneath. If they have no information underneath, if you're not basing the attitude on the real facts, it won't work. It won't stay. And then finally, persuade. You've got to provide incentives as to why you should go with me and not with your old beliefs. That's the hard part, but we've got a lot of different ways of doing it, which I'll talk about throughout this course, or this class. I'm not keeping up with my own stuff. What you need to do when you're doing this sort of thing, the first requisite is you understand how to project information. You got to understand that resistance is there, that you're going to meet resistance. That's it, that's necessary. Then you have to adapt the message to the circumstances of the group. And finally, you got to engage parents, if possible, in the persuasive process. They ought to be your first line of presentation, of persuasion. They ought to be the first presenters. Okay? The message has to combat resistance. And I'll say this, in my lab we have a big poster that's probably 6 meters long, big print. It says, expect resistance. People are not going to agree with you. Most of your audience won't like you, won't agree with your message at first. And you need to convert them. Let me see what we're doing here. Okay, so most of the work that's been done in prevention in our field classifies risk in terms of socioeconomic status and race. If you're poor, you're at risk. If your parents are not educated or you're not educated, you're at risk. If you're black, you're at risk. I find this distinction useless for my purposes. What I'm interested in is what you're thinking about. So our questions are very simple to define risk. Have you ever used, let's say we're talking about marijuana now, we typically focus on one drug because the message that we would give depends upon the drug that you're using or that we're trying to stop you from starting. Have you ever used marijuana before? No. Okay. Do you think you might ever use marijuana? Definitely not, all the way to definitely yes. If you say definitely not, I say to you, or to me, that person is a resolute non-user. They're resolutely not going to use drugs. They will, but at least they're going to put it off for a while. If you don't say definitely not, then I say you're vulnerable, you're at risk. And it makes a difference. That simple 2 questions allow me to put you into one category or another. categorization system actually works. Let's see if I've got that here. Did we do it? Yeah, we did. We did a national sample, before I show you the results, we had a national sample available to us of a sample that was representative of every 12 to 18-year-old in the country. A beautiful sample. And we broke the sample, we took all of the non-users from the sample, all of the kids who said, no, I don't use. And we said, okay, have you ever used? No. All right. Do you think you might in the future, like in the next 12 months? Definitely not. Do you think maybe sometime in your life you'll ever use this drug? Definitely not. Okay, you're not vulnerable. You're resolute. If you answer anything else, we considered you vulnerable. Does it make a difference? That sample was studied for 4 years. And the usage rates were watched. So the first year, where the hell? Oh, I'm going backwards. So the first year, everybody starts at 0. Because only people who said no, never, no, I have not ever used this drug, those people got into the sample. Random sample. In the second year, round 2, every round is a year, the people who we judged as resolutely anti-drug, about 10% of them had started using. But about almost 40% of the kids who hadn't used in year 1 had started using by year 2. In year 3, the resolute non-users, about 20% of them had fallen into use. But 58% of the others who started out at 0 are now 57%, 58% of them are using. And by the 4th year, it rose to about 26% versus 66% of that group. That simple two-item distinction predicted this. That's pretty good for 2 items, don't you think? So we use that in all of our research because it makes a difference. Because what we found out later is that those 2 groups are not differentially, the same communication doesn't work the same way on both groups. You have to figure out who it is you want to deal with, who it is you want to talk to, and create your message accordingly. The vulnerable non-users, the kids who didn't use but would never say never, they were not at all open to communications that were even vaguely threatening, even vaguely negative. They didn't like that at all. Why not? Because they were leaning that way to begin with. And it made them uncomfortable. The non-users, the resolute non-users, were fine with it. We could tell them almost anything and they would go for it. Okay. So, I keep going backwards. I don't know why I do that. Okay. I think I told you that already, so I won't go through it again. So this caused us to think about a different kind of approach. The second study, we were interested in what we could do. Let's see, do I remember this right? Mitigar resistance. Okay, my slides are either here or there or out of order, but that's okay. What I wanted to say here is before we go into the schools, before we go into any kind of real live research rather than secondary research, which is the data are already there and we analyze them again. As we go into the schools, we go into the populations we're dealing with, and we learn what people are thinking, what the kids say, the language they use, and how they do it. You can't start creating a message until you know that. We were called into a school because the children were using solvents, inhalant drugs. And they were very worried about it because some of the kids were showing up at the schools extremely high with solvent all over their mouths. And solvents can kill you. And they were afraid of that, and they called us in. And so we started talking to the children, and we found out that for the most part, they didn't know anything. And this is what really got me started working in this field. And I talked to a young kid, and he said, well, I said, why do people use those? He said, you see those kids over there? Yeah. They're the leaders in the class. Everybody likes them. The most popular kids in school. And they all use inhalants. This is what we call them, solvents. And if I use them, I can get to be popular too. Jeez, that is so incorrect. The logic of that is just backwards. And so I felt bad about that because this kid was putting himself at grave risk and didn't even know it. And didn't know why. So we decided to try and change that in the school. So we created 2 films. One film was a film about bullying, about kids beating other kids, because the school was having that trouble too. My son is a director. I said, okay, make me a film, 15 minutes about bullying, about how to stop it, what to do about it. He did. It was a nice job. And then we created a 2-minute TV advertisement of our own. So the kids are sitting there, and in our schools there's a Channel 1, which is a TV station. And the teachers flick it on when they're tired, and they have the kids watch something. So they're watching this movie about bullying, 15 minutes. After 10 minutes, a word from your sponsor cuts in. We take an ad from a computer manufacturer, from Dell, we rip it, put it into our slides, and the kids watch it for a minute. Then our ad comes on. Our ad changes a lot of things. In one case, the person developing or presenting the ad is a good-looking young high school girl. And she's talking to junior high school girls. They look up to high school people. Okay? In the other ad, it's the same girl, but she's dressed in scrubs, in doctor's uniforms, with a stethoscope, and we shoot the ad in the emergency room of a hospital. My wife was the vice president of the hospital, so we got the room for free. Okay, so the other thing that we did was we wondered who the kids would want to listen to. Would they want to listen to this girl or the doctor? And whether it made a difference if they were using or not. And the third thing we wanted to know was from some research that I was reading, and I thought this might be interesting. In the old literature, it's called the overheard communication effect. The idea is if you hear somebody saying something and they're not even talking to you, you're much more persuaded by it because they're not trying to persuade you. You're not defensive. So I said, what if we had this girl, when she's delivering a message, this actress, do one of 2 things. All of this is systematically broken in our design, the very, very tight experimental design. In one case, she's talking to kids, and she's saying, students, there's something I think you ought to know. And it's either the young high school girl saying it or the doctor. Same person. Different audiences. In another case, also instead of different audience, it's all of these random and so forth. I mean, we were really good. Our designs are perfect. In the other case, we manipulate even the content of the message. In one case, it's, these drugs will make you a social outcast. People who use inhalants usually are loners. They do it behind closed doors. Nobody likes them, and so forth. The other group got a more physical message. These drugs can hurt your kidneys and your liver. They can seriously mess you up. Okay, so now we have three variables going. Okay, same source, a good-looking young woman who's either a doctor or a high school girl, the threat, which is social or not social, and the apparent target of the audience, which is the parents or the kids. All right? These are the messages. Same message in both cases. What happens is very interesting. What happens is among non-users, among kids who don't use and say, I will never use, almost everything worked. No matter what, they were saying, no, I'm not going to do this stuff. I hate the idea. In the future, forget about it. I'm not doing it. But the vulnerable non-users were very much moved by the message that was played apparently for the parents. And so were the users. They were listening to this, and it moved them. Because they weren't defending themselves against the message. They were very resistant when it was, students, there's something you should know. That, they said, well, no, don't try and persuade me. But if it was the same message aimed at their mothers, parents, there's something you should know, they listened. And not defensively. And it worked. The social harms were effective with the users. The physical harms message was not. They rejected it. On the other hand, when we asked them, who, at the end of this talk, who would you like to talk to the most? Most of the kids said, oh, the person who's in high school, the high school girl, it'd be fun to talk with her. Except the users. And they wanted to talk to the doctor. Because they, at least, were somewhat apprehensive about what they were doing to themselves, and they wanted to know more. Okay? So it isn't the general rule in persuasion is make sure your source of your message source is the same as your audience. That's true in general. But in this case, if you've got an audience that's apprehensive or scared, it's not true. There you get somebody who can answer their questions, who they trust. So this gave us pause. We took this, the feds picked this up, our government, and as part of a major campaign, the one that I just told you failed miserably for $1.4 billion, they had a side campaign which essentially had a parent talking to their kids about a problem. Or talking to a neighbor about a problem. And the kid, the film went like this. The woman is talking to her neighbor about a problem, the camera is this way, and they see a kid sneaking down the stairs to sneak out the back of the house. And the parent catches them. He says, oh, no, you don't. Go back, you've been grounded, you're stuck in the house now for the next month. Don't think about going out. That worked. It worked because it looked like the ad had to do with parents talking to parents about teaching parents what to do. It didn't. It worked because the kids heard this message and didn't defend themselves against it. So it's clear we ought to use parents as our leaders, but we don't. Another study we did, this was, I do all my studies with my students because I find them smarter than me and and work harder. So this was a simple study. We gathered every single study in the literature that we could find that looked for the relationship between parent communication and drug use. Okay, simple as that. And what we found in 16 of those 17 studies, this was called a meta-analysis, where we combined all of this data across 35,000 students, is a strong relationship between talking with your kids and the kid not using drugs. Simple as that. Do you talk to your kids about drugs? Yes. Much less usage in the drugs. Okay? It was stronger among girls than boys, but we also found in other research that parents watch their girls more carefully than they watch boys in the United States, probably everywhere. So they have more communication with them. Okay, my director's telling me to hurry up. So I'm going to go to study 4. Where am I? Let's see. This was a study that we did looking at what the parents knew or thought they knew about their kids and what their kids were doing. And could the child's parents project an expectation to the child or not? And would those projections, if they're positive, cause the child to delay usage of drugs? Or if they're negative, if I think you're using drugs, will you have more of a tendency to do them, even though you're not? So parents can help, but they can also hurt. And this is part of my talk. I want to warn parents, you got to be right. You got to do this right. If you don't, you're going to have trouble. So we started, again, another national sample of U.S. teenagers. And we asked them, you asked the kids in year 1, 2-year study, have you ever used this drug? We asked the parents in a different room, has your kid ever used this drug? Parents either said yes or no, and the kid either said yes or no. Okay? The next year we went back to the kid, not the parents, and we said, in the past 12 months, have you ever used this drug since the last time we saw you? Okay? You get this, you get the idea? You get the study? Well, here's what we found. This will surprise you. At time 1, these are the kids who said no, I've never used, and the parents said no. And after a year, about 10% of the kids had started using. Okay? That's more or less the normal progression. How about the kids who had said no, and whose parents says, yes, I think that kid has used drugs? About 30% of that group started using. That difference is significant at probability level less than 1 in 1,000. So that finding would occur once in 1,000 times by chance. This ain't chance. There's an effect here. So you say, well, what caused this? How can this be? And I'm telling you how it can be. One hypothesis, the parent's expectation somehow got transmitted to the kid. The kid knew it, the kid somehow understood it, and when you have a prophecy like that, it fulfills itself. We know a lot about self-fulfilling prophecies because but the field has done probably 50 studies of this, and it's for real. That's one possibility. The more cynical among you will say, the kid was lying. But my question to you, cynics, is how come he quit lying in year 2? Why did he start telling the truth? Well, there's a way of testing this out more or less logically. We say, how about the kids who you know weren't lying? The kids who weren't trying to please the interviewer. Who are those kids? They're the kids when they ask them, have you used any drugs in the past year? They said, yeah. So now we're starting with groups of children. 100% of them have used in their prior lifetime, before I got into the room and I started asking them questions. This is what they look like. Everyone now is starting at 100%, right? First year, everybody says, yeah. They said yes, and the parent says yes. And by the end of this, by the second year, about more than 80% of them were continuing to use. Some had quit, or some had been arrested, or some, not arrested, but had been beaten up by their fathers or thrown out of school, and they learned a lesson and said, I'm not doing this anymore. Or someone done it and got sick and said, no more. Okay, so 80% of them or more continued using. How about the kids who started and whose parents said, no, my kid has never used these? What do they look like? They look like this. That's not chance. That doesn't happen by accident. That expectation got transmitted to the parents, and I don't know another way of explaining that result. Okay. Auxiliary analyses, you can read them. Basically, parents who expected their kids to use drugs, talk with them more about drugs, more frequently, with less hope. They didn't think it was going to work. All right? Kids who weren't using, whose parents thought they were, was the same thing. It's sad because the parents actually, I think, were pushing these kids into drug use more than needed to be. Okay. Is it that the parents really didn't know what their kids were doing? No, they did. 78% said it was very probable, or at least a little bit probable, among the users. Among the non-users, 79%. Okay, no difference. If I use something, what do my parents know? 79 or 78% said no, they wouldn't. Okay? What does that mean? And yet we know that at time one, the correlation between what the kids said and what the parents says was very strong. What does that mean? It means the parents knew. But the kids didn't know that they knew because their parents never talked to them about it. Why not? Because they didn't know how. Okay. I'm going slowly. Here's another study. This is an easy one. We looked at parents' usage. Does it matter if your parents are smoking drugs in the house? Well, now that it's legal in the United States, how do you got half the country smoking it when they come home from work? Does it make a difference to the kids? Well, let's look at what the kids do. Do they expect less punishment if they use themselves? They expect more from the drug? They think, oh boy, this is going to be great when I start using if I do. And the attitude is more positive. What do you think that turns into a year later? You get this huge jump in child usage as a factor of those variables. I mean, any fool could have predicted that. Any fool in the legislature who's making this crap legal could have predicted it, but they don't bother predicting it because it would cost them money. Okay, gets me sick. I got to catch up with myself. Ooh, I was high behind. How many of you have been told when you were a kid, don't hang out with that group, they're no good? Nobody? I know you have. Your mother told you not to hang out with me. But she might have been right. Okay. What we found, it's sort of difficult to explain quickly, but I'll try to. What we found is that kids with a good relationship with their parents smoked less marijuana. Why? It's not what you think. They smoked less marijuana because they were associating with people who smoked less marijuana and didn't offer them anything. They didn't get as many offers. 60% of the people that we talked to in some of our research, we said, when did you first start? Oh, I started 2 years ago. How did it start? Oh, a friend of mine offered me one. If your friend doesn't offer you one, there's 60% chance, less chance that you're going to start. If you have a warm parent-child relationship and you listen to your mama and she says, don't hang around with that guy, and you don't, you're not going to get the offer. Okay? Simple as that. This is something that looks horrible, but it isn't. This has to do with alcohol. One of my students was interested in alcohol use, and she did a study. This was on data from a huge study in the United States. It's been going on for 30 years. And what we're interested in is whether or not parent alcohol use causes problems with the kids. Now, in a lot of places, a lot of times during our lives, we would offer our kids a little sip of something at Thanksgiving or Christmas. Here, you want to try a little sip of wine. And the kids invariably would want to. They take a glass or take a sip of it and spit it out. That's horrible. And we thought that was a good thing. It isn't. It turns out that's a very bad thing to do. We didn't know, but now I do. So we're looking at parents' alcohol use and parental warmth, which is how close are you to your child? Can your kid tell you anything or everything and get away with it and not be scared to do it? Because that's what you're aiming for. And we also looked at parental control, which is monitoring. I'm watching you like a hawk. Everything you do, I know what you're doing. That works, but not very well. But if it's paired with parental warmth, then it works. Then everything works. Look what happens. First year, we take these measures. And we ask the kids then, how easy is it for you to access alcohol? And what would your parents think about you using alcohol? And those things are related. All these positive signs say there's a positive relationship between parent alcohol use and parent perception. So they perceive you using as well, so it's not so bad. If the parent's not using it, would be the opposite, okay? Ease of access leads to alcohol use in high school. Now we're going from kids all the way to high school. All of these variables load in here positively. Alcohol use in high school leads to binge drinking in young adulthood, in college age, doesn't have to be in college. Again, positive relationships, you can see these arrows, which ones really make a difference here. So, access, use as a kid leads to use as an older kid. Parental alcohol use leads to binge drinking. And by the time you get to the age of a person when he's 25 or 30 years old, those people who are doing this, and all of these things, have led to them having much higher odds of having an arrest record, of having been arrested for something. I don't know if it's for drinking or not. The data weren't that clear about it. But that's an astonishing finding. This is the one paper in my entire career, out of maybe 3 that I submitted, that got accepted immediately. Don't do that. Nobody does it. Okay? So parents can have a huge effect. They didn't have to say anything to their kids about drinking, don't drink, and so forth. All I had to do was drink in front of their kids. Imagine what going home and smoking a joint must do. So what do we do about this? We use the equip. We try to engage the audience. We try to question their attitudes. We try to really threaten that attitude. Say, this is stupid, and here's why. And we try to inform. Here's why it is. And we try to persuade. Try to get you on our side. When we do this, we can cut into that process. We cut into the cyclical process that you saw here. Okay? We can get these kids in college and stop them from binge drinking. So all of this crap that happens beforehand, we can put a stop to their effect. We can do it. This is a cycle. You break into one part of the cycle and the cycle breaks. We can do it. We do it with persuasion. And we use various tactics of persuasion, which I don't have time, I'm told, to talk about. But those tactics work. And I talked to you about already some of them. Okay? And if you're interested further, write me and I'll send you these slides and you can study them if you want. So the idea is if you're going to have a study involving kids. Let me tell you what that says in English. Don't promise too much. Don't try to do too much. You don't need to do too much. Don't use fear-arousing ads. Don't try to scare people. They don't work. We've known since 1954 that they don't work. And yet every time I go to a new country and talk to the Minister of Education or of Justice who says, I'm in charge of prevention, I say, great, what are you going to do? I'm going to hit this button and you're going to see some ads that will make your hair fall out. It's so scary. Every time. I say, how much persuasion have you learned about? Well, I don't need that. I know this will stop people. No, it doesn't. It doesn't work. Nobody believes you. It's silly. And sometimes I'm successful. Unbelievable ads don't work. And the problem is, if you fail, it generates more resistance than for the next guy who's trying to prevent. There's a good literature on that now, and it's scary. Don't fail, because if you do, you're going to make it more difficult for me going in and trying to do my job. Disgusting ads don't work. We don't like to see things that are disgusting. We don't like, if you see something disgusting, you turn away from it. If I show you an ad with a disfigured face and a person talking through a voice box, you may feel sympathy for the person, but you don't want to see that ad again. If they don't watch your ad the second time, you've got no chance, because media don't work instantaneously. Okay? You need multiple exposures. For kids, if you're doing campaigns designed for kids, get the parents involved, if possible. And if it's not possible, make it possible. You can't miss out on using parents. It's too important. It's too important. They're too good if they know what to do. And you got to tell them. So a lot of your ad ought to be focused on parents, because the kids won't resist them in the first place, so you got that going for you. And then you got parents who can talk to their kids and know what to say. Every time I give a talk at a school, we use the students for research, we'll come back and say, here's your payback, we're going to tell you what we found and so forth, and what we think about it. They'll come up. Usually a parent, usually a father will come up to me and say, I agree with everything you say, but I can't talk to my kid about this stuff. He knows more than I do. And I say to them what you should say to the next parent who tells you that. Look, ask the kid, if you take this drug, what does it do? Does it make you feel different? Does it make you see differently? Does it make you happier? Does it make you sadder? Does it make you lose your balance? All of those things. Does it do any of those things? Yeah, it does this. I get happy. I get I get really hot. Yeah, fine. Where's it happening? It's happening in your brain. You willing to take a risk with your brain? Okay, I gotta go.
Thank you very much. Bill, meu professor, my teacher. Ok, vamos já na sequência aí. That's okay, Bill?
Yes.
Tá bom. Please. Ah, não. Relax, tranquilo. Obrigado. Mais uma salva de palmas para o Bill.